Hi, you're on the Betrayal and Beyond channel. The catalyst wasn't a secret text or a suspicious credit card charge. It was a smell, the sterile, cloying scent of bleach. I come home early from work, a rare occurrence, hoping to surprise my wife, Rowan, with takeout from her favorite Thai place. But as I opened the door to our apartment, an apartment that felt more like her minimalist art gallery than my home, the sharp, chemical smell hit me first. It was overpowering, an aggressive attempt to erase something. In the center of our living room, on the pale gray rug she'd spent a month selecting, was a large, damp patch. Rowan was on her hands and knees, scrubbing furiously, her back to me. She was so focused she didn't hear me come in. "Rough day with the Merlot?" I asked, try for light tone. She jumped, a choked gasp escaping her lips. She spun around, and my forced smile evaporated. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a kind of primal fear I had never seen on her before. It wasn't the look of someone who had spilled wine. It was the look of someone who had just hidden a body. "Elias," she breathed, her voice tight and unnatural. "You're home. I didn't expect you." "Clearly," I said, my gaze fixed on the damp patch. "What happened?" "Nothing. I knocked over a vase. Water everywhere. I was just cleaning it up," she said, but her hands were trembling. Vases of water don't require this level of chemical warfare. I walked closer, my heart beginning a low, heavy thud. And then I saw it. Tucked under the edge of the sofa cushion, trying to hide, was a single, overlooked shard of dark brown glass. It wasn't from any vase we owned. I knew our inventory by heart. Every object in our home was carefully curated by her. This shard was from a beer bottle, a craft ale by the looks of it. I don't drink beer. I haven't in years. Rowan called it uncivilized. I didn't say anything. I just bent down and picked up the shard of glass, holding it between my thumb and forefinger. I looked from the glass to her terrified face, and in that silent, agonizing moment, an entire universe of unspoken truths passed between us. I didn't need to ask who had been here. I didn't need to ask what happened on her precious gray rug. The frantic scrubbing, the smell of bleach, the fear in her eyes. It was a confession louder than any words. She saw the understanding dawn on my face, and her expression crumpled. But it wasn't into a look of remorse. It was a look of frustration, of anger. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was furious that her cleanup operation had failed. "So what?" she finally snapped, standing up, the pretense falling away. "What did you expect, Elias?" The question hit me with the force of a physical blow. What did I expect? I expected the woman I had rearranged my entire life for to not bring another man into our home, into our bed, and then try to bleach the evidence out of the rug. I expected fidelity. I managed, my voice sounding hollow and distant. She laughed, a short, sharp, bitter sound that held no humor. "Fidelity? You want to talk about fidelity? Where's the man I fell in love with, Elias? The man who wrote poetry on napkins and planned spontaneous trips to see meteor showers? The man who had a fire in his eyes? Where did he go?" "He stared at her, speechless." She was turning this on me. She was making her betrayal my failure. "You're not him," she continued, her voice rising, a prosecutor laying out her case. "You're a ghost in a sensible sweater. You manage accounts. You talk about market trends. You traded your soul for a salary, and you expected me to just sit here and watch you fade away? I needed to feel something. I needed to be with someone who was alive." Every word was a carefully chosen dagger, aimed at the most insecure parts of my heart. And the most terrifying part was, she was partially right. I had faded. I had let the fire go out. But I had done it for her. For this life. For the stability she'd claimed she craved. The man she wanted, the poet, the adventurer. She had systematically sanded him out of existence. She had called my poetry a cute hobby and my travel plans financially irresponsible. She had steered me toward the stable, soul-crushing job in finance, celebrating my promotions while subtly mocking the passions I had left behind. She had been the architect of my gray life, and now she was condemning me for living in it. I looked around the sterile, monochrome apartment, at the abstract art that meant nothing to me, at the furniture I never felt comfortable in. I looked at this woman whose love I had craved so much that I had willingly amputated pieces of myself to keep it. And I realized the affair wasn't the disease. It was just a symptom. The disease was the slow, creeping erasure of my own identity, an erasure I had not only permitted but actively participated in. The betrayal wasn't that another man had been in our home. The betrayal was that for years, I hadn't been there either. I didn't yell. I didn't break anything. A strange, profound calm settled over me. It was the calm of the man who has finally hit rock bottom and realizes he is standing on solid ground. "You're right," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He's not here." I dropped the shard of glass onto the damp patch of the rug. The small clink was the only sound in the room. "I'm going to go find him," I said. I turned and walked to the bedroom, leaving her standing there, her weaponized words suddenly useless. She had expected a fight, tears, a dramatic scene. She had no idea what to do with my quiet acceptance. I pulled an old, worn-out duffel bag from the back of the closet, a relic from my previous life, and began to pack. Not the clothes she'd picked out for me, but the things I had hidden away. A faded t-shirt from a climbing gym, a worn copy of a Kerouac novel, a half-empty journal. She followed me to the doorway, her confusion morphing back into anger. "What are you doing? You can't just walk out. You wanted to be with someone who is alive," I said, not looking at her as I zipped the bag. "I'm going to see if that person still exists. But he doesn't live here anymore." The greatest tragedy, I realized, wasn't that she had stopped loving me. It was that I had stopped being someone I could love myself. I walked out of that apartment without looking back. The click of the door closing behind me was the sound of a cage opening. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a destination. For the first time in a decade, my life was a blank page, and the feeling wasn't terrifying. It was electrifying. I got in my sensible four-door sedan, a car chosen for its safety rating and resale value, and just drove. For the first few hours, my mind was a storm of her accusations. Asterisk, you're a ghost in a sensible sweater. You traded your soul for a salary. Asterisk, the words echoed, not because they were cruel, but because they were laced with a venomous truth. I had let my life become a series of sensible, safe choices. I had optimized myself for her approval, trimming away the passions and quirks she deemed inefficient. The man she'd betrayed was a hollowed-out version of the man she'd fallen for, and I was the one who had carved him out. As the city lights gave way to the dark anonymity of the highway, a different feeling began to surface. It was a quiet, bubbling sense of liberation. Every mile I put between myself and that gray apartment felt like a step back toward myself. I wasn't running away from her. I was driving towards the ghost she'd accused me of being. I drove all night, fueled by cheap coffee and the sheer, raw novelty of making a decision that wasn't pre-approved or on a shared calendar. When the sun began to rise, I found myself pulling into a small, forgotten town nestled in the foothills of a mountain range I hadn't seen since my college days. On a whim, I checked into a cheap motel with a flickering neon sign, the kind of place Rowan would have described as depressingly authentic. I spent the first week in a self-imposed exile. I didn't call anyone. I didn't check my email. I left my phone on silent, ignoring the barrage of texts from Rowan that ranged from furious to feigning concern. Instead, I walked. I hiked the trails that snaked up into mountains, my office soft body protesting every step. I sat by a river for hours, watching the water carve its path through ancient stone, a quiet lesson in persistence and change. In my motel room at night, I opened the journal I had packed. The first few pages were filled with my old, looping script, fragments of poems, observations, dreams of places I wanted to see. The last entry was dated 8 years ago. I picked up the cheap ballpoint pen from the nightstand, and for the first time since then, I wrote. I didn't write about her or the betrayal. I wrote about the ache in my muscles, the taste of the cold mountain air, the way the light looked on the trees. I wrote until my hand cramped, filling the empty pages, and it felt like reclaiming abandoned territory in my own mind. One afternoon, in a dusty local bookstore, I found a flyer pinned to a corkboard. It was an ad for a wilderness first responder course, an intensive, month-long program in the heart of the mountains. It was the kind of thing the old Elias would have done in a heartbeat. The sensible Elias, the one with quarterly reports and a mortgage, would have scoffed at the impracticality. I stood there for a long time, the flyer in my hand, standing at a crossroads between the man I had become and the man I wanted to find. I thought about the secure, predictable life I had just left. Then I thought about the word alive. I walked to the counter and asked to use the phone. I signed up. The course was brutal. It was physically and mentally demanding, a world away from the air-conditioned comfort of my old life. We learned to set splints, treat hypothermia, and navigate by the stars. I was surrounded by a different breed of people: ski patrollers, river guides, and search and rescue volunteers. They were people whose lives were written on their faces, etched with sun and wind and experience. They didn't talk about market trends. They talked about weather patterns and near misses. No one asked me what I did for a living. They asked me what I had seen. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged. I wasn't Rowan's sensible husband or a successful financial manager. I was just Elias, the guy who was surprisingly good at tying knots and surprisingly bad at starting a fire. I was learning a new language, the language of capability and self-reliance. I was rebuilding myself from the ground up, not for anyone else's approval, but for my own survival. The true turning point came during our final simulation, a mock disaster scenario deep in the backcountry. My partner and I had to locate and stabilize a victim with a compound fracture. As I knelt in the dirt, my hands confidently assessing the injury and directing my partner, a profound sense of peace washed over me. This was real. This mattered. The hollow feeling I'd carried in my chest for years was gone, replaced by the thrum of purpose. I had been so afraid of losing the life I had built with Rowan, but I realized now that I hadn't lost anything of value. I had only lost a cage. On the last day of the course, as we were packing up our gear, I finally turned on my phone. There were dozens of missed calls and voicemails. The last one was from Rowan, left a week ago. Her voice was different. The anger was gone, replaced by a weary, hollow tone. "Elias," she said, the apartment is so quiet. I've listed it for sale. I think I'm going to move back west, be closer to my sister. I wanted to say, you were right. The man I fell in love with wasn't there anymore. I just didn't realize I was the one who made him leave. I hope you find him." There was no apology, not really, but there was an admission. And in a strange way, it was the only thing I had needed to hear. It wasn't forgiveness she was offering. It was freedom. The freedom from a narrative where I was the one at fault. I deleted the message. I didn't need to hold on to it. Her story didn't have power over me anymore because I was finally writing my own. I looked up at the vast, blue mountain sky, took a deep breath of the cold, clean air, and knew, with absolute certainty, that I already had. The end of the course felt less like a conclusion and more like a commencement. I had a certification, a new set of skills, and a duffel bag of worn-out clothes that smelled of pine smoke and freedom. But I had no intention of going back to my old life. The thought of returning to an office, of putting on a tie and staring at spreadsheets, felt like a voluntary return to prison. I had a small amount of savings, enough to last a few months if I was careful. Instead of looking for a flight back to a city that held nothing for me, I bought a beat-up 20-year-old pickup truck. It was rusted in places and smelled faintly of oil, the complete opposite of my previous sensible sedan. It was perfect. I threw my gear in the back and started driving south, with no destination other than away. My journey became a pilgrimage to my own past, a quest to rediscover the passions I had buried. I drove to the deserts of Utah and climbed the red rock towers I had only ever seen in magazines. I spent a month working as a volunteer on a trail crew in Arizona, my days filled with the simple, satisfying ache of physical labor under a vast, open sky. I was rebuilding trails by day and rebuilding my own soul by night, writing in my journal by the light of a headlamp. I was living on almost nothing, but I had never felt richer. I was shedding the last remnants of the man who needed external validation. The approval I sought now came from a perfectly set anchor on a difficult climb, or from the quiet satisfaction of a hard day's work. I was reconnecting with a fundamental, more honest version of myself, a man defined by what he could do, not by what he owned. During this time, I had a few brief email exchanges with my lawyer. The divorce was proceeding uncontested. Rowan had moved, and the apartment, our old life, had been sold. The money from my half of the sale was sitting in a bank account, untouched. It felt like money from another lifetime, and I had no idea what to do with it. 6 months after I walked out of that apartment, I found myself in a small, dusty town in West Texas, nursing a cheap beer in a local dive bar. I was just passing through, but something about the place, the vast, empty landscape, the resilient, no-nonsense people, resonated with me. The bartender, a woman with a weathered face and kind eyes, named Maria, struck up a conversation. She asked me what brought me to town. I'm not sure, I admitted, and for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel like a failure. I'm just trying to figure out what's next. A lot of people are just passing through, she said, wiping down the counter. Fewer and fewer are staying. Not much here for them, I guess. She told me about the town. It was struggling. The young people were leaving for the cities, and the local businesses were drying up. The town's only real tourist attraction, a small, local outfitter that ran guided trips into the nearby national park, had just gone out of business after the owner retired. A quiet idea, small and fragile as a desert wildflower, began to take root in my mind. I spent the next week talking to people. I talked to Maria. I talked to the former owner of the outfitting company. I hiked the trails in the park, my mind not just seeing the beauty, but also the potential. The place was stunning, a hidden gem of rugged canyons and stark beauty, but had no infrastructure to support tourism. I thought about the money sitting in my bank account. I could keep it, invest it, and live a safe, comfortable life. It was the sensible choice. It was the choice the old Elias would have made. But I wasn't him anymore. I took the biggest risk of my life. I drained my savings and used the money from the sale of the apartment to buy the defunct outfitting company. I bought the dusty storefront, the old gear, and the 2 beat-up Jeeps. I spent months renovating the place with my own hands, sleeping on a cot in the back room. I hired a couple of young, experienced local guides who had been out of work. We named it Far Peak Outfitters, a nod to the journey I had taken to get there. It was the hardest work I had ever done. There were days I was so exhausted and so terrified of failure that I almost gave up. But every morning I would wake up, look out at the mountains bathed in the morning light, and feel a sense of purpose so profound it was almost overwhelming. It's been 3 years. Far Peak Outfitters is the thriving heart of this small town. We run climbing, hiking, and river trips. We've brought a new, sustainable form of tourism to the area, and in doing so, have helped revive the town. Maria's bar is full most nights, and a new cafe and a small one have opened on Main Street. My life is unrecognizable from the one I left behind. My hands are permanently calloused. My face is lined from the sun. I don't own a suit. My apartment is a small, cluttered space above the shop, filled with maps, gear, and books. It's a mess, and it's the most beautiful home I've ever had. I'm not a ghost anymore. I am here, fully, completely, and unapologetically alive. The poetry has even started to come back, scrawled on the backs of receipts and in the margins of guidebooks. Rowan's betrayal was a destructive act, an attempt to tear me down to justify her own choices. But she failed. She didn't destroy me. She inadvertently blasted away the rock face of a life I had built on a false foundation, revealing the solid, load-bearing core of the man I was always meant to be. She wanted me to fade away, but instead, she gave me the greatest gift I could have ever received. She gave me back to myself. Thank you for listening to this story on betrayal and beyond. What part of this journey resonated with you the most? Was it the initial, quiet act of walking away, or the final, brave decision to build a new life from scratch? This story is a powerful testament to personal rediscovery. Have you ever had a moment that forced you to reconnect with a version of yourself you thought you had lost? Let us know in the comments below. If this story inspired you, please like and subscribe for more. And remember, sometimes you have to lose the life you plan to find the life that is waiting for you.